Hi, everybody. It's me, Jeff, and I'm coming at you with my review of the book that I selected for this class, which is The Walleye War, which was written by Larry Nesper. It's a very interesting book. It sort of deals with the series of conflicts that happen in the late 1980s, early 1990s between a particular tribe called the Ojibwe. They have a number of names, actually. They're sometimes called the Chippewa, but the Ojibwe is how they're referred to most often in this book, so that's kind of the term I'm going to use. The Ojibwe people and essentially just local fishermen and local Americans, because the Ojibwe attempted to uphold their treaty rights that gave them sort of unrestricted access to certain hunting and fishing locations in court. That was held up, and that caused a huge backlash and outcry for a number of reasons, which we'll get into. But essentially, there's this big sort of like local conflict in Wisconsin between the Ojibwe and all the other sort of residents of the area over hunting and fishing rights. In particular, the fishing rights, which I'll get into. The book was written, as I mentioned, by Larry Nesper. So I decided to do some research on Larry Nesper to see kind of where he's coming from. And Larry Nesper is a professor of anthropology. He teaches at the University of Wisconsin, in fact, and his specialty is the Ojibwe people. He has spent a significant amount of time with them. He has a number of friends within the tribe, within the community. He's written a total, or co-written, a total of 3 books so far that I could find, and he has several sort of published articles. But this book, The Walleye War, was his very first ever published book. It was published in 2002, and it's the very first book that he ever wrote. So this is kind of his sort of freshman attempt at being a published author, at least in a book. And you can definitely tell, I have some criticisms of the book, which I will share in a little bit. But overall, I do think it is well written. And it's interesting because you're getting insight into these issues from somebody who's not a tribal member, but is very sympathetic to them and has many friends who are tribal members. And for much of the book, he interviews different tribal members and talks to them and kind of gets their sort of first-hand perspective on these events, which is important, I think. And basically what it is Larry Nesper decides to join with these spear fishermen of the Ojibwe in order to get their perspective on spearfishing, because spearfishing is a very sort of controversial topic within the fishing community in general, not even including Native American treaty rights and all that stuff. Just spearfishing in general is kind of a controversial topic within the fishing community. And people that fish tend to have strong opinions about that. Some people are very much in favor of it. I would say most traditional fishermen tend to be very against it, at least for freshwater fishing specifically. I myself am an avid fisherman. It's a big part of the reason why I chose this book is that I am a fisherman myself. Freshwater fishing, saltwater fishing, fly fishing, I've pretty much done it all at this point. I have never been spearfishing. Like many fishermen, I do have an opinion about that, which I will share later on because it is relevant. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to read this book. I wanted to get sort of different perspectives on spearfishing. And Native American perspectives in particular, because spearfishing is a very traditional way of fishing for the Ojibwe. It's the way their ancestors have always fished. And so it's very important to them sort of culturally. But it's something that's very like divisive, like I said. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So like I said, Larry Nesper sort of works with these spear fishermen and talks to them because essentially the book is about the Ojibwe people who live in Wisconsin and who, many of whom rely on subsistence fishing and subsistence hunting. Many of them live in poverty, particularly in the time period from when this book which is the 1980s, early 1990s. Many of them were living in poverty. Many of them relied upon extensive fishing and extensive hunting to put meat in the freezer. And that meat in the freezer was how they were putting food on the table. And that's something that their culture has always done. The Ojibwe have been subsistence hunters and subsistence fishermen for centuries, since prior to the European arrival, much prior. So that's something that's always been very important to them. And so he kind of talks to them about these issues where essentially they get the U.S. Court of Appeals to recognize their right to certain lands that they were granted under treaties that gave them unrestricted hunting and fishing rights, and there's a huge backlash against that. And he's kind of trying to get to the bottom of what is the source of this backlash? Is there any legitimacy to it? And why does that backlash eventually lead to violence? Because it does. Eventually, there's gunfights, and there's people being beat up, and there's bottles and rocks being thrown at people, and racist graffiti, and some crazy stuff goes down over fishing and hunting rights. And I'll get into that as well. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the structure of this book. So one thing that he does that I think is very good is that he doesn't just launch into it. He takes his time providing a lot of sort of cultural context of this area of Wisconsin, life on the reservation for the Ojibwe, what their sort of lifestyle is like. And he talks about them historically and their culture, which I think is important. It is actually over 100 pages before he really gets into how the Walleye War starts. So he takes his time with setting up the sort of cultural context that leads to this conflict, which I think is a really good thing. And he starts off a little bit talking about the history of the Ojibwe, which is really interesting and has some really interesting parallels to what happens in this book. Because for most of their history, the Ojibwe did not really consider themselves to be a united people. Right? That's something we've talked about in this class before, how sort of European conceptions about race and being a people and what that means, those sort of conceptions might not have been held by many of the Native Americans they encountered, and that's certainly the case for the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe are actually 6 different bands of six different bands of Native Americans. They're not necessarily one group. They're 6 different individual bands, and for most of their history, they certainly did not consider themselves to be one people. Not at all. They did sort of speak a common language, and they did live in nearby each other, and they traded with each other and fished and hunted in the same area, and, you know, they were certainly nearby each other, but they didn't consider themselves to be one specific race. They didn't consider themselves to be one specific tribe, and that would not change really until the late 1700s, early 1800s, when European fur trappers and traders started showing up in Wisconsin. And they began killing all the game in Wisconsin, not for food, but for profit, right, to sell those furs for money. This caused a dramatic reduction in the amount of game that was available to be hunted, and all these different bands relied on hunting game and fishing to put food on the table for their children. That's how they had always lived. They were subsistence hunters, subsistence fishermen. Well, when the hunting and fishing isn't so good anymore, the ability to put food on the table kind of becomes non-existent. And so these fur traders were really an existential threat to all 6 of these different bands, and they would end up actually uniting, sort of banding together in order to address that. And there would be a series of violent conflicts between the Ojibwe and these sort of fur traders that were coming in and trying to kill all the game for profit, which is kind of interesting. And there's definitely some parallels between that and what happens here, where the Ojibwe are trying to uphold the sort of treaty rights that they were given by the U.S. government, and there's a big backlash against that, which leads to violent conflict. Right? So the history of the Ojibwe is very interesting. But essentially, there's a series of conflicts between the Ojibwe and these sort of fur traders. There's quite a bit of violence. This eventually leads to what's known as the Treaty of 1842. In which the Ojibwe agreed to give up many of their ancestral lands to the United States government. They agreed to sell their ancestral lands. They were given reservation lands, just like many other tribes. Unfortunately, the reservation lands, just like many other tribes, it was not good quality land. There was not a lot of game to be hunted. And there weren't a lot of sort of good river or lake systems from which they could fish. So, as part of the deal that the Ojibwe struck with the U.S. government, they were given the unrestricted right to hunt and fish off of reservation land. And there were certain areas that they were allowed to hunt and fish on, unrestricted. It wasn't like they could just go wherever they wanted. They had to stick to kind of a certain area. But they could leave the reservation, go to those areas, which typically did have a much more abundant supply of game, much more abundant supply of fish, and they could put food on the table. One of those areas is a significant part of Lake Superior. The Mille Lakes, which is a very famous lake, famous for its walleye population, was another one of them. And so they were allowed to go to these different sort of river systems, these different sort of woodland areas, and they were allowed to hunt and fish off of the reservation, and they had unrestricted rights to do that. However, unfortunately, for much of the Ojibwe's history, those sort of treaty rights weren't really upheld and they weren't really protected. In the early 1980s, this would eventually lead to a lawsuit that made it all the way up to the U.S. Court of Appeals called LCO versus Vought. And LCO versus Vought upheld the terms of the Treaty of 1842 and said that the Ojibwe had unrestricted hunting and fishing rights in these sort of areas that were guaranteed to them. So like the Mille Lacs Lakes, like Lake Superior, or parts of it. And that meant that they did not have to abide by bag limits, right? A limit on how much fish you can take. They did not have to abide by slot limits, sort of a limit on how long the fish can be. They did not have to purchase fishing licenses or hunting licenses. Under the terms of the Treaty of 1842, they had unrestricted rights to these areas to hunting and fishing. And that means no limits as far as game limits or as far as licensing requirements. Pretty much immediately after this happened, members of the Ojibwe tribe celebrated by going out and spearfishing in many of these areas and taking, as many fish as they wanted, as was their right under the Treaty of 1842 that was upheld in 1983. Many of them began going out and shooting deer in these areas that were guaranteed to them under that treaty, and they took as many deer as they wanted. At this time, Nesper talks about how most of these people are living in absolute poverty. I mean, crushing poverty. And they really are relying on hunting and fishing just to put food on the table. So once it becomes clear that, no, actually, they can hunt and fish as much as they want, they all go out and they start hunting and fishing all the time in order to put food on the table. However, this was met with outrage by the local community, and I mean outrage. When it sort of gets out to the local community that Native Americans, specifically Ojibwe now, will be allowed to go to the Mille Lacs, just for example, with spears and stab as many fish as they want. And that's not a right that will be extended to anyone that's not a tribal member. Non-tribal fishermen quickly get up in arms about that. And at least early on, they're also joined by actually environmental groups. A lot of environmental groups are kind of upset about this decision as well. And there's a reason for that, which I want to kind of get into, and which Nesper, I don't feel necessarily does the best job of getting into. Sorry. So, Nesper is not a fisherman. He admits that in the book. He is not an experienced fisherman. He's not really involved in the fishing community. And I am. I'm an avid fisherman. I also work at the fishing department at Cabela's in addition to my teaching job, so I interact with fishermen all the time. One of my best pals is, he wins sport fishing awards every single year. I'm friends with charter boat captains. I'm very involved in the community, and I'm aware of what sort of issues tend to rile them up, shall we say. And spearfishing is definitely one of them. And specifically because the whole point behind slot limits and size limits when you're fishing is to hopefully maintain a healthy fishery by preventing people from spearing undersized fish before they can get old enough to spawn, to create the next generation of fish. Because if you kill off a significant portion of the fish before they spawn, the numbers of that species of fish are going to decline, and they're going to decline rapidly. And if that trend continues, eventually they will go extinct. So spearfishing in general tends to be controversial because here's the thing about that. If I go out fishing with a rod and reel and I catch a fish that's undersized, and I'm out fishing for food, I want to eat whatever I catch, I can just throw him back. He's got a little hole in his lip. He'll probably survive. Some fish do die fishing with rod and reel. It just is what it is. But most of them will survive, right? So if I catch an undersized fish, it's probably not a big deal. If I'm spearfishing and I see a fish that I think is big and I hit it with the spear and I kill it, and it turns out it's actually not big enough, I can't take it home and eat it, I killed an undersized fish, there's no putting it back, it's dead. I just killed an undersized fish. And if enough people do that, the number of the fish are going to decline rapidly, like I just said. And so that's part of the reason why spearfishing tends to be a little bit controversial. Not helping that fact is the fact that most spear fishermen, because they are killing their fish, they're not doing catch and release, they are obviously taking their fish home to eat, which means they tend to want to be spearing fish that are generally considered good to eat or considered tasty, right? And those fish tend to be the fish that have the most pressure on them. Various species of salmon tend to be very pressured because salmon taste really good. It's a well-known fish that tastes very good. So because of that, a lot of salmon populations around the country really are either endangered or have been close to the endangered species list. And spearfishing for them is going to get people up in arms, and I mean big time up in arms. And that's without Native American treaty rights and only certain people can do it. I'm not even talking about that. I just mean if you go out and you start spearing salmon, people are going to get mad. And I mean mad at you for that. So you have this sort of maelstrom of, it's this way of fishing that's very controversial already. But here's the thing. Spearfishing is very traditional to the Ojibwe people and is very important to them. Larry Nesper actually opens the book where he's talking to a man that is actually hand making his spear. A lot of them will hand make their spears and they'll sort of sharpen the spear tip themselves. And he opens it where he's interviewing one of these guys who's a spear fisherman who is making his spear himself. And that's very culturally important to them. And the way these guys conduct spear fishing, the way these Native Americans conduct spear fishing is they go out at night because they're usually going after walleye. And walleye, for those of you that don't know, their eyes glow in the dark, so you can see them under the water if you shine a light on them at night because they have eye shine. They'll go out at night, usually in these small, aluminum frame john boats. One of them will stand typically at the front, one of them at the back, both of them with spears. They shine a light around. Once you catch eye shine, if the walleye is near the surface, you then jab your spear down and try to kill it, right? And then bring it on board. The other reason why this is so controversial, which Nesper doesn't really go into, and which I think is important, and the reason why environmentalist groups were actually involved in this and were not happy about the decision, is the fact that most of these Native Americans were going after the walleye when they come into shallow water. Because obviously if the fish is super deep, I mean, unless you have a spear that can get down there, you're just not going to have much luck spearing a fish, right? You got to get them when they're in the shallow water. Here's a problem with that. On these lakes, the walleye come into the shallow water when it's time to spawn. That's when they're on the shallow areas. So they're in the shallow areas when it's time for them to create that next generation of fish, and you're creeping up on them in a boat and stabbing them with a spear. Yeah, that's not really a good thing if you want to preserve the health of the fishery. Stabbing pregnant females with spears, not really a great idea if you want to maintain a healthy fishery. And so that's the other reason. And that's a big part of the reason why there's so much backlash against this. And in fact, very quickly, there starts to be this sort of outrage in the community, and the community starts organizing these sort of activist groups to oppose this. The main one, which is organized by a guy named Dean Christ. And Dean Christ forms this group called the Stop Treaty Abuse Wisconsin. And it's an organized campaign that basically spends most of its time harassing spearfishers. And they do stuff like throw rocks at them, throw bottles at them, they vandalize their vehicles, they vandalize their boats, and this starts to escalate very, very quickly. By 1989, this has escalated to violence, and there have even been a few incidents where spear fishermen and protesters have exchanged gunfire. Yeah, the violence escalates within a couple of years and becomes a real problem. And soon you have, every time spearfishing season opens up, you have large crowds of protesters gathering, complaining about Native Americans practicing spearfishing, which they have the right to do under the Treaty of 1842. And you have violence breaking out between the two groups. And then you have the police coming in to try and break up the violence, and it rapidly gets out of control. And that's why it's called the Walleye War. I should mention that the various Ojibwe bands do quickly decide that they should attempt to do this right. If they're going to have this right to spearfishing, they decide that they don't want the walleye, obviously, to go extinct, and so they decide to establish a spearfishing season, in which if you are a tribal member, you can spearfish, but you have to do it within season. The season is only 1 week, and they do try to introduce bag limits. You can only take X amount of fish. Problem with that, though, is there's internal tensions about that within the tribe. And Nesper goes about the middle of the way through the book. He goes into a great deal of detail about that. Sorry, I can't talk tonight. He goes into a great deal of detail about that. Some members of the tribe, including most of the tribal leadership, are very much, hey, if we're gonna have these spearfishing rights, that's fine, but we do need to preserve the health of the fishery. We can't be killing all the fish. We need to have slot limits. We need bag limits. We need, a certain time where you can fish and then a certain time when you can't. We need to try and preserve this. We can't just stab all the walleye while they're spawning. Like, eventually there's not going to be a lot of walleye left to stab. But you have others that say, you know what, no. You have other members of the tribe, some of whom are very outspoken, that say, no, the Treaty of 1842 says we have the right to fish however we want, and we have the right to fish when we want. Fish is how we're putting food on the table for our kids. Our rights have been denied to us since the treaty was signed. The U.S. hasn't really played fair with it. And you know what? No. If I want to go out and I want to spear a fish so I can have dinner for my kids tonight, I'm going to do that. And according to the treaty, which the U.S. federal government has upheld, nobody, including the game wardens, can tell me no. And that's true. The game wardens aren't really allowed to stop them from doing that. So the tribe is sort of trying to internally police the issue and preserve the sort of stock of walleye and make sure that they're not just being speared to death left and right. To some success, Nesper does say that he does think that the majority are sort of obeying the sort of limits they introduce. But there's a lot of people that aren't obeying that as well, that are sneaking off every night, and, they're stabbing fish left and right. And pretty soon, the rhetoric against that has become violent. Dean Christ's sort of group, Stop Treaty Abuse Wisconsin, they start spray painting the slogan, Save a Walleye, Spear an Indian, all over the place, which obviously has incredibly racist connotations. When I read it, it very much reminded me of the old phrase, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. It's that sort of rhetoric, that sort of slogan, and it's just horrible. And it's a very violent thing to say. And as I mentioned, within a couple of summers, violence is escalating. It starts off with these people protesting. And at first, many of the protests are actually kind of peaceful. The summer of 1984 and 1985, there's environmentalist groups that are protesting. And those environmentalist groups, tended to not shout racist things and throw bottles at people. But they were protesting. But very soon, Dean Christ and, his kind of people are showing up, and they're drinking and they're at these protests, and then they're throwing the bottles, and then the violence is escalating from there to the point that eventually people are actually launching their own boats and going out and harassing the spear fishermen at night. They're ramming them with their boats. They're taking guns and firing shots across the bow. Yeah, it's getting bad, and that doesn't actually surprise me as a fisherman. I can tell you right now. There is kind of a dark side to the fishing community where some people do take it too far. And again, that's without even racial tensions. Just last year, right here in Massachusetts, just last year on the Cape Cod Canal. The Cape Cod Canal, one of the premier striper fisheries in the United States. It's a great place. But just last year on the canal, there were 3 stabbings and at least 1 shooting over fishing spots. Somebody was fishing, and then someone else came along, hey, that's my spot, you can't be there, and then it escalated, and there were at least 3 stabbings, at least 1 shooting that I'm aware of. I'm sure there were many fist fights. That kind of thing does happen. People take fishing really seriously, and a lot of fishermen, quite frankly, are not afraid to fire a shot across the bow. They're not afraid to pick a fight with you if you do something that they don't like. There is kind of that rougher element to it. Add in these sort of extreme racial tensions that start to show up, these sort of hateful slogans, that starts to creep in, and it starts to get worse. And these spear fishermen are eventually, essentially being shot at night. And so Nesper sort of interviews these Native American spear fishermen, to talk about how they feel about that. And it actually does have the effect of uniting them. In a big way. Many of them feel that the upholding of the Treaty of 1842 was a big victory for them. And many of them actually feel that they have the right to fish these areas, and while many of them do try to abide by sort of the tribal slot limits that they introduce, they're not going to back down in the face of this sort of aggression from these sort of white fishermen that are trying to intimidate them. And they continue to go out, despite the fact that people are shooting at them, are throwing rocks at them, are sticking knives in their tires, are spray painting these sort of racist slogans on their cars. They refuse to back down. They continue to go out. They continue to fish. How does it ultimately end? Well, By the summer of 1991, the governor sort of introduces a series of bills to kind of crack down on this because the protests are getting out of control and they're being recorded on TV. I mean, newspapers are reporting on them and news stations are filming them. So the sort of violent protests are showing up on people's television screens, and it doesn't make them look good. So he empowers the police to arrest anybody that's harassing spearfishermen. He also introduces a bill that creates a $1,000 fine for anyone that harasses a spearfisherman. So if a fish and game officer or just a regular police officer catches you harassing a spearfisherman, even if you're just shouting stuff at them, even if there's no violence, they can fine you for $1,000. Not a small chunk of change today, and certainly not a small chunk of change in the year 1990. And so that cuts down on it big time. They also begin introducing limits on parking like big vans and stuff near boating ramps, which obviously prevents big news vans from showing up. And this is back before you could just film stuff on an iPhone. So without the big news vans that can hook up to the big cameras, it's tough to get footage of all these protests, and so it kind of dies down. As these things sometimes do. Something's in the news and it's the big thing for a while, and then eventually it kind of dies down. And that's sort of what happens because of that, and because, as I mentioned, no one wants to pay $1,000. And so it eventually sort of dies down. Overall, I think this is a very good book. I really like the way he structured it, that he talks about the Ojibwe people and their kind of history, how they're brought together because of oppression relating to fishing and hunting rights. That's what brings them together. That's what makes them go from these 6 different bands who kind of get along, but they don't consider themselves a people or anything. They don't feel any kinship with each other, to a group of people that feel a kinship with each other, that feel like a family, like a tribe. And it's because of them sort of fighting for their lands and their rights that sort of brings them together like that. And then you fast forward to the 1980s and you see a repeat of that, where there is a stronger sort of tribal unity because of the Walleye War. They continue to engage in spearfishing to this day. I'm sure there are people in the local community that are not happy about it to this day, because there's people in the local there's people in fishing communities everywhere that do not like freshwater spearfishing. Even without, like I mentioned, all the sort of racial issues that tends to come in with that. But as far as I know, there hasn't recently been any sort of giant protest like that. There hasn't been any sort of extreme violence. In terms of sort of my criticisms of the book, so the big one is the fact that Larry Nesper is not a fisherman. And I think there's a couple things he could get into there that would have been interesting and would have related to the Ojibwe struggle. Like, I'm not saying that I wanted to read a book about, a fisherman commenting on this stuff. Obviously, his goal here is to talk about the sort of native tribe and their history and how the history is kind of repeating and the sort of oppression that they're facing. Obviously, that's his main focus. But one of the things that I think he really should have talked about is... Did the sort of environmentalist and did sort of Dean Christ and his sort of group have a point about this sort of unrestricted spearfishing negatively impacting the walleye population? Did they have a point about that? Not saying that I agree with Dean Christ and his group and the things that they did, because what they did was basically domestic terrorism. I'm certainly not saying that I support that, but are they right that spearfishing, and in particular spearfishing at the time of the year when spearfishing is done, which is the spawn, aka not the time to be stabbing fish to death, are they right that was an existential threat to the walleye population? Was that a problem? Did they have a point? After this sort of treaty was upheld and after these people began spearfishing all the time, did the walleye population decline? Nesper basically just does not address that at all. And that was one of the things that I kept wondering, like, do both sides potentially have a point here? Because obviously I'm very sympathetic to the Ojibwe reading this. I understand the desire to fish the way your dad has always fished, right? The way your grandfather's always fished, that sort of ancestral connection to your land and the way you've always done things and tradition. I totally get that. Having to hunt or fish just to put food on the table, I mean, I'm not going to begrudge somebody that. I'm very much against poaching. I'm very much against people that take over their slot limits in fishing. That said, if someone needs to catch a fish just to have something to eat that night, am I going to make a big deal out of it? No. And so I'm very sympathetic to them. At the same time, Did the walleye decline because of this? That's like a question that I had in my mind as a fisherman. And I think it's relevant here. Did these environmentalist groups, some of whom were not racist, some of whom were not Dean Christ in this organization, right? Some of whom were not throwing beer bottles and shooting at people. Some of whom were really concerned about the walleye going extinct in these lakes. Did they have a point? So I decided to do some sort of extracurricular research on that, and I began looking up like Mille Lacs Lake and Lake Superior, and I began looking into this. I did see that in Mille Lacs specifically, the walleye population today is declining. However, most of the researchers attribute that to global warming and pollution and a variety of other factors. It does not appear that spearfishing is even on the list. So as far as I can tell, based on that, the answer is no. The walleye population has not severely declined because of spearfishing. And so that kind of vindicates the Ojibwe in a way, right? That they were right, that their spearfishing hasn't led to the walleye going extinct, or hasn't led to a steep decline in their numbers. As far as I can tell, that seems to be the case. And that's something that interests me because, and I want to get into, why did I choose this book specifically? Well, I'm a fisherman, so of course I chose something to do with fish, but also because I mentioned that I have an opinion on this, and I'm just going to be honest with you guys. I'm against most freshwater spearfishing. I do not approve of freshwater spearfishing. I definitely do not approve of snagging hooks and those sort of methods of fishing. We sell those at Cabela's, and I've complained to my lead before that I don't think we should, to be honest. I don't think we should sell them. That's something I'm against. And a big part of the reason for that is, like I mentioned, the fish that people tend to want to spearfish, tend to want to stab to death, are the fish that people want to eat. Those also tend to be the fish that are not having a great time of it as far as not being endangered goes, right? Like salmon, I mentioned salmon. We have a very limited supply of landlocked salmon here in Massachusetts. They basically exist in two bodies of water, Wachusett Reservoir, which is a place I fish regularly, and the Quabbin Reservoir. And if someone were to introduce a bill to begin spearfishing those salmon, I would be very, very against that. Very against that. Because both of those populations are kind of precarious, and I don't think stabbing them with spears is a good idea, to be blunt. Particularly since both of those species also spawn in the shallow, so that's the only time you're going to be able to spearfish for them. So yeah, I'm not really all about that. So I have an opinion, right? And part of the reason I chose this book is I wondered, would this change my opinion? Because I'd be getting the perspective of people that have always spearfished and for whom spearfishing is a big part of their culture and way of life. And it's a group of people that have always done it. And, they did it for centuries without driving all the fish extinct. And so I wondered, would I walk away from this book with a different perspective or maybe even a different opinion? I'll be honest, I'm still not really in favor of spearfishing, and I would still 100% oppose a bill to spearfish all the salmon in Wachusett and Quabbin here. Not in favor of that at all, and I'm not going to be. That being said, from what research I was able to do, it does seem clear that these Native Americans have re-engaged in their sort of culture of spearfishing, and it hasn't led to a decline in the walleye population. At least there doesn't seem to be any research that indicates that. And so ultimately I have to walk away from this book feeling that they were vindicated and that their spearfishing, which is culturally important to them and lets them put food on the table, hasn't been a big problem. And so some of those environmentalist groups were maybe wrong. And Dean Christ and his ilk were certainly wrong. And I also came away from this book really thinking about how sort of these ideas of manifest destiny and, people that are not Native Americans controlling this land are still around today in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think of. Because here you have a group of people, of Native Americans, attempting to exercise their rights to lands that they have a right to. And they're immediately met with violence for that. Or almost immediately, I should say. There was a progression of violence, as I mentioned, but they're met with racism, they're met with fistfights, they're met with thrown rocks and bottles, racist slogans, and eventually they're met with gunfire. And so, what is that if not a modern form of manifest destiny, of people that don't have the right to this land attempting to come in and use force to essentially say that they do? to say that they get to decide what Native Americans get to do on land that they're entitled to. These Native Americans can do whatever they want on this land. According to the treaty, it's their land, and they can hunt it and fish it as much as they want to. And here you have a group of white Americans attempting to stop that. And I really can't think of a better term to describe that than manifest destiny. A group of people who don't have the right to this land attempting to use force to exert control over this land and its resources. And like I mentioned, I see a strong connection to what brought the Ojibwe together in the first place, which is these fur traders coming in and them attempting to control the Ojibwe and them interfering with the Ojibwe's way of life. That's what brought these bands together in the first place, and that's certainly what brought them together even stronger in the late 80s, early 90s. I do think this is a really well-written book. If any of you are interested, I would encourage picking it up. I do wish Nesper had explored a little bit of, because I feel like you could walk away from this book not really clearly understanding why are all these groups so upset about spearfishing? Like, what is the deal? Nesper's not a fisherman and doesn't really understand why spearfishing is controversial within the fishing community in general. And like I mentioned, he doesn't really go into asking the question of, are these groups of people that are protesting correct that the walleye population will decline or possibly go extinct in these lakes because of spearfishing? He doesn't really get into that at all. So you might walk away wondering, like, why are these people so upset about it? Like, what is the big deal? And I do think he could have maybe done a little bit of a better job explaining that. That being said, his section in the beginning on the Ojibwe history is fascinating. It's really well written. Later on, when he talks about the modern Ojibwe, the poverty they live in, how important spearfishing is to them culturally, that's really well done. He features a number of interviews with Ojibwe tribal members that are really well conducted. He asked really good questions there, and that kind of stuff really gets you thinking. And then when he eventually does finally get to the Walleye War, when he does kind of get into these conflicts, he does do a good job with the actual narrative, and he does show the kind of escalation of violence until eventually, the guns are out and people are shooting at each other. And he does do a good job of showing how that kind of builds up. The tension builds and builds until it explodes, and then the state has to come in with fines and police officers and kind of put a stop to that, right? So yeah, overall, I do think it's a good book. I would recommend picking it up if any of you are interested in it at all. And I personally found it interesting. Did it change my opinion of spearfishing? Not really overall, not really. But it did lead me to conclude that I don't really have a problem with the spearfishing that the Ojibwe are practicing today, because it doesn't seem to have had a negative effect. It is their land that they have the right, under the treaty that we signed with them, that the United States of America signed with them, they have the right to hunt or fish on that land however they so choose. And I believe that the United States needs to start honoring those treaties because we have not done so for so long. So if that's what we said, we should abide by that, and we should let these people fish the Mille Lacs and Lake Superior and all these other sort of river and lake systems however they see fit, because it is their right to do so. So that's sort of what I think, and thank you all for listening.